And then he goes on to write that he was happy to see the Pope just yesterday, as you just point out, Ben. Also, the Vice President writing that though he was obviously very ill, so the Vice President's observation there made public during his moments with the Holy Father in that meeting that perhaps many people expected not to happen. And then we see him sitting there in front of the Vice President and having that conversation as well. We are also getting other reaction from around the world, with Spain Prime Minister Sanchez hailing Pope Francis as a commitment, being somebody deeply committed to the most vulnerable. Ben, you are in Rome. As you pointed out earlier, it is a holiday. So a lot of people certainly not working today. If you could just set the scene for what it's going to be like today, and certainly in the weeks to come during this period of mourning for people there in Rome and specifically in the Vatican.
Well, today began like a very nice early spring day, and I think people were making plans to go to the beach, go picnics, and I think now the atmosphere is clearly changed. I think a lot of people are going to change those plans and go to St. Peter's Square just to express perhaps their condolences, to just to be in an important place at an important time. And I think what we're going to see is that the normal rhythm of this very busy city is going to change in the coming days and perhaps weeks as we prepare for the funeral and then, of course, the conclave to choose the next, to elect the next pope. So this is not going to be a couple days of mourning and that's it. This is going to be weeks of what we've seen before. I mean, I was here for the death of John Paul II, the resignation of Benedict XVI, and it really is sort of a long process that will begin. And certainly it begins today with profound sadness for many people, and it will end after the conclave when we see the white smoke coming from from the Vatican. We will see who the new pope is. I'm not going to delve into who the possible candidates are. I think it's a little premature for that kind of speculation. But this is a process through which Rome has been many times before over centuries, so it's not an unfamiliar process. But every time a pope dies, it really sort of has an impact on people that goes beyond sort of your normal political leaders, because this man is not just a prominent figure in Rome itself, but he is the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. So certainly I think Rome's going to be busy, and we're going to be busy for the coming weeks. Polo?
Indeed, and I hate to take more of your time, Ben, but I wonder if you could just in the last few moments here tell us a little bit more about what we do know about the circumstances of Pope Francis's death, obviously taking into consideration at his advanced age and also in his delicate state of health. What have Vatican officials confirmed about the circumstances of the Pope's death?
Well, they did put out a statement this morning, and just read it. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of his father. His whole life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. So basically, 7:35, Pope Francis passed away. They haven't given any details as to why, but I think it's not too difficult to understand why. He spent weeks and weeks in Rome's Gemelli Hospital suffering from double pneumonia, and since then he came out, and the doctors, when he left the hospital, suggested that he rest, that he not exert himself. But Pope Francis was well known as a very headstrong individual. When he wanted to do something, he's the Pope. You can't tell him no. And I think what we've seen, certainly with the amount of activity he's been engaged in since leaving the hospital, is that he continued to insist on carrying on with a full schedule. Yesterday, he drove around St. Peter's Square in the Pope Mobile. He addressed the faithful. He met with J.D. Vance. Clearly, he thought he was regaining his strength. But as I said, a man 88 years old with a long history of health complications, this is what it is. 7:35 this morning, according to the Vatican. Pope Francis passed away.
Yeah, certainly not a surprise to Catholics around the world. Nonetheless, painful and shocking for so many because of what he contributed during his time for well over a decade as the head of the Catholic Church, as Catholics around the world now waking up to news that Pope Francis has died. According to Vatican officials, he was 88 years old. This now essentially starting that period between the death of the Pope and the election of another, which essentially started, as Ben points out, in the 7 o'clock hour local time when his death was confirmed. Cardinals will now have to decide when that funeral can take place, and after that, when that conclave can begin. But as Ben points out, we are still weeks and weeks away from that. At this point, the focus certainly is on what we know about the death of Pope Francis and the reaction for Catholics all around the world. Ben, you are in Rome this morning. You mentioned what will certainly be this seismic shift in the mood after celebrating Easter weekend to now preparing to say farewell eventually to Pope Francis when the funeral begins, which again, we're waiting for those details as well. Would you like to share a little bit more about what people there, the immediate reaction that you've been getting from people in Rome after they got word of the Holy Father's passing?
Well, the immediate reaction, I'll tell you, was from my wife, who is Italian. And I was the one who informed her because I was informed by CNN of the death. And she, just gasped because she, like so many other people here, was a great admirer of the Pope. And as I made my way to the CNN bureau here, I could see people on their phone, and I could hear people talking about the death of the Pope. And this is the sort of thing that I'm sure that there are very few people at this point, at this time of the morning in Rome on a holiday, who are unaware that the Pope has passed away. And as I said, it leaves a big hole because this was a pope who was popular. Not all popes are popular. Some popes, I'm not going to mention who, were seen as dour and sort of distant, but this was a pope who spoke the language of the people. He was from Argentina, but of Italian origin, and his preferred language of discourse in public was always Italian. Italian with a bit of an Argentinian accent, but Italian nonetheless. And he really struck a chord with people that I think previous popes didn't necessarily do that. And so I think people are going to feel his loss profoundly. And as I said, Italian politics, like politics elsewhere at the moment, is very rough and nasty, and some of the sort of the vocabulary being used, people find crude and unpleasant. Pope Francis was somebody who spoke softly, who spoke with words of kindness and compassion. And he was somebody so many people here admired for those very reasons. And as I said before, he was somebody who expressed concern at times when others were talking realpolitik about things like Gaza, Ukraine. He was concerned about the people, not politics, not power, not leaders, not presidents, not prime ministers. He was concerned about the people. So I think his passing really will leave a void, perhaps filled by his successor, perhaps not. We don't know at this point, but it leaves a void that people, not just here in Italy, Rome, but well beyond, throughout not only the Catholic world. For instance, I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. Many Muslims looked at him as a positive figure on the world scene, somebody who expressed concern about the suffering of all people, not just Christians, all people. And so I think his passing really does leave an empty space that will be hard to fill. Polo?
Pope Francis's reach, as you point out, certainly knew no limits. That is Ben Wiedemann, CNN senior international correspondent in Rome, gathering the latest. Ben, thank you so much for spending so much time with us and sharing all that valuable insight. You've been there along the way, covering this papacy that now ends with his death, again, at 88 years old. Ben, thank you. Italian Prime Minister as well, the Italian Prime Minister as well, responding and reacting to Pope Francis's death, issuing a statement just moments ago. The Prime Minister writing, "I had the privilege of enjoying his friendship, his advice, his teachings, which never ceased, not even during times of trial and suffering. We say goodbye to the Holy Father with a heart full of sadness." Again, that statement coming from the Italian Prime Minister just hours after Vatican officials confirmed the death of Pope Francis, dead at 88.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Made by the former ambassador, who was then barred from receiving communion and put into exile by the Church after he rejected the authority of the Pope and some key Catholic teachings. Nevertheless, questions remained about Francis's handling of the abuse crisis.
There is no doubt that the child sexual abuse scandals are the central stain on his legacy. I mean, over and over again, Pope Francis said the right things. He met with victims. He expressed heartfelt sorrow. He expressed resolve to get this right. But, you know, most critics, many victims, would say that was...
About what we know.
Well, Paulo, we were told this morning that there would be a brief broadcast from the Santa Marta, the residence of Pope Francis, and then a few moments later... He also held a
brief meeting on Sunday with the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, turned out to be the last U.S. signatory that the Pope would meet with. Francis became the first Latin American Pope in 2013, and he was one of the oldest popes in the Church's history. Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis was a vocal champion for the poor, for migrants, and also for the environment. And also in part of the Vatican statement announcing his passing, Cardinal Karen Farrell said, quote, "He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and most marginalized." Again, the Vatican announcing the passing of Pope Francis at 88. CNN's Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb taking a look back at the Pope's life and his legacy.
Buonasera.
A simple good evening from the newly elected Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio from Argentina, the first Pope ever from the Americas. His choice of the name Francis, after the saint known for his poverty and love of nature, had never been used before by a Pope, set the tone for a pontificate marked by attention to the poor and a simple way of life. This Pope's home would no longer be the historic apartments, but a simple set of rooms in a guest house on the Vatican grounds. Elaborate papal robes and jewellery remained in the closet, as Francis wore only his white cassock, black orthopaedic shoes with a simple pectoral cross. And when he needed his glasses fixed, he hopped in a car and went himself to the optician in Rome. A down-to-earth style learned on the streets of Buenos Aires. The one-time nightclub bouncer took public transportation and always remained a fan of Argentina's San Lorenzo soccer team. His simple words, too, had a way of getting to the heart of divisive issues.
If
a person is gay and accepts the Lord and has goodwill, well, who am I to judge?
It didn't change the Catholic Church's opposition to gay marriage, but convinced many that he was a pope open to change. He was a champion of the environment, issuing an encyclical, the highest papal teaching document, to warn of the dangers of global warming and a throwaway consumer culture in the West that damages our climate and the livelihood of the poor.
The misuse and destruction of the environment are also accompanied by a relentless process. In effect, a selfish and boundless thirst for power and material prosperity leads both to the misuse of available natural resources and to the exclusion of the weak.
He drove home the point travelling to the United States, home of gas-guzzling SUVs, in a tiny Fiat. Equally at home with the poor and powerful, on the lawn of the White House, he made a plea for immigrants.
As the son of an immigrant family, I'm happy to be a guest in this country, which was largely built by such families.
And at a time marked by a dramatic refugee crisis in Europe, Francis tirelessly called on governments and people to not close their eyes or their borders. And he walked his talk, bringing back 12 Syrian refugees on his plane following a trip to the Greek island of Lesbos. In the difficult terrain of the Holy Land, Pope Francis prayed at the wall dividing Palestinian West Bank from Jerusalem and embraced his Jewish friends in front of the Wailing Wall. The Pope focused much of his attention to those on the peripheries, as he called it, the outsiders, excluded from society.
The hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, those in prison.
He sought to support the churches on those peripheries and far from Rome. The longest foreign trip of his pontificate saw him travel across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, highlighting the importance of this region for the future of the Catholic Church. Going to those on the margins was something Francis himself practiced during many moments of his pontificate. Embracing the disabled, washing the feet of prisoners, installing shower rooms for the homeless around the Vatican.
One of his characteristics, a characteristic of his entire life, was humility.
A humility that attracted the world, with politicians and stars lining up to meet him at the Vatican. He was not so popular at times inside the Vatican and among powerful Catholic groups in the United States. There was a backlash from conservatives upset about his insistence that church teaching must develop, along with his biting critiques of clerical culture. His financial reforms seeking greater transparency faced significant difficulties, and the scandal of sex abuse continuing to be the Catholic Church's biggest struggle. In the case of Chile, Francis admitted in a letter that he too was part of the problem when every bishop in the country offered to resign in the wake of sexual abuse scandals there. Also accused of being part of the problem by his ex-ambassador to the United States, who claimed he told Francis about sexual abuse allegations against former Washington, D.C. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick 5 years before, and Francis allowed him to continue serving.
I will not say one more word on this.
Francis eventually defrocked the US cardinal and held an unprecedented global meeting of bishops to address the issue. A Vatican investigation later called into question the claims made by the former ambassador, who was then barred from receiving communion and put into exile by the Church after he rejected the authority of the Pope and some key Catholic teachings. Nevertheless, questions remained about Francis's handling of the abuse crisis.
There is no doubt that the child sexual abuse scandals are the central stain on his legacy. I mean, over and over again, Pope Francis said the right things. He met with victims. He expressed heartfelt sorrow. He expressed resolve to get this right. But, you know, most critics, many victims, would say that that wasn't matched with a policy follow-through.
When the coronavirus pandemic hit in 2020, the image of the Pope blessing the world from an empty St. Peter's Square became a symbol for that desolate time. Francis urged nations to share their vaccines with poorer countries and vaccinated hundreds of homeless and underprivileged at the Vatican. The following year, during an historic trip to Iraq, the first Pope ever to visit the country, Francis stood on top of the rubble in Mosul, once an ISIS stronghold, and furthered his outreach to the Muslim world by an unprecedented meeting with top Shia Muslim cleric, the reclusive Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. From the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022, Francis was an outspoken advocate for peace. He avoided outright condemnation of Vladimir Putin, but publicly appealed to the Russian president, begging him to stop for the love of his people, the Pope said. Francis spoke several times by phone with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during 2022, asking him to be open to serious peace proposals, before the pair met face-to-face at the Vatican in May of 2023 and October 2024. He made similar appeals for peace during the conflict in the Middle East, saying that the Israel-Hamas war had descended into terrorism. He insisted that war is always a defeat, and said self-defense that is not proportional is immoral. Francis' most important message was one of fraternity, that we are all brothers and sisters, despite our differences. Take care of the earth and each other, he said, and don't forget to pray for me.
And just in the last few moments, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who had just met with Pope Francis over the weekend, on X actually issued a statement. I'll read you a portion of that. The Vice President writing, "I just learned of the passing of Pope Francis. My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill. but I'll always remember him for the below homily that he gave in the very early days of COVID. It was really quite beautiful. May God rest his soul. And then he attaches that. Again, that's the Vice President who had just met with the Holy Father at the Vatican the day before the confirmation of his death now. Let's get more analysis and more reporting now from Elise Ellen. She's a senior correspondent for Crux, which covers the Vatican and the Catholic Church. Elise is in Rome. Elise, good morning to you on what is already extremely busy and extremely eventful and shocking morning for Catholics around the world. What are you hearing from those there at the Vatican about the death of Pope Francis?
Oh, good morning. I think the word that you said sums it up most aptly. Shocking. This morning, everyone woke up with the joy of Easter still very much being felt. In Rome, you know, the day after Easter, Pasquetta is still a holiday. Most people spend this day in celebration with their family and their friends. So this was quite shocking for most people here in Rome this morning, especially after, you know, Pope Francis's sort of triumphant outing yesterday. You know, he appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's, gave the traditional noontime Easter blessing, and it was his first time going out and driving around the crowds, you know. So, you know, even though he was frail, even though he was still obviously sick and struggling, I don't think anybody expected that he was quite at the point of death. You know, it was seen as sort of a triumphant moment for Pope Francis after his very long hospitalization just, you know, a month ago. So the word, I think, right now is shock. People are in shock. They're still absorbing the news and trying to wrap their heads around, you know, the fact that such a big personality is no longer with us.
And not only as a journalist, but also as a Catholic myself, I'll have to tell you, I'm struck by just the last few days and what we've seen from Pope Francis. There was so much uncertainty, so many questions about whether or not we would even see him make a public appearance. And then he begins the Easter weekend by visiting that prison, praying with those inmates, however, unable to participate in the traditional washing of the feet, and then makes his way to Easter Vigil as well. And then on Sunday, we see him aboard that Pope Mobile in a very iconic scene. Just walk me through what it's been like the last 3 days for people there in Rome from your perspective and what you've seen.
You know, the last few days, obviously, there's always a lot of excitement here, you know, in anticipation for Holy Week. It's the most sacred week on the Catholic Church's calendar. Easter is the most sacred liturgy. So there was a lot of excitement because, you know, in the days ahead, you know, Pope Francis, after he got out of the hospital, he was discharged on March 23rd after having spent 38 days in the hospital fighting double pneumonia. And, you know, it's under doctor's orders to observe a strict 2-month convalescence, you know, a time of rest without going out, without meeting groups. And Pope Francis, as he often, you know, has, you know, as he often did, you know, throughout his papacy, sort of, you know, took that with a grain of salt. We started seeing him appear, you know, his first public appearance after his hospitalization was April 6th. And we've been seeing him, you know, with increased frequency since then. So there was a lot of anticipation over the last week about, are we going to see the Pope or not, you know, and excitement over the fact that it was very much assumed that, you know, for Catholics and for everybody here in Rome, that they would see him on Easter. So there was a lot of excitement, a lot of buzz around the papal liturgies. You know, even though they were celebrated by aides, you know, Pope Francis did make himself known. He popped out, you know, in the Basilica on Saturday prior to the big Easter Vigil. He was not able to celebrate that himself, but he made a surprise outing and blessed some pilgrims. He had a moment of prayer. He was giving candy to children. And there was just a lot of excitement on Easter, too. People knew they were going to see Pope Francis. And I think that's the most comforting thing. People felt comforted because after such a long hospitalization and such a serious ordeal that he had been through, to see him there, you know, as leader of the church, implying that at least in that moment he was still with us, was something very special. I think it was a very special, you know, celebration for a lot of people, which makes today's news so much more difficult.
Yeah, so many people are likely to see that as a farewell gift, that last appearance. At least you cover the church. You speak to not only the faithful, but to church officials as well, and fully appreciating what will be a long process, a mourning process before we reach Conclave. Just from your perspective, What will the church need next as it turns the page and looks for its next leader when that time comes?
Well, that is a big and complicated question. I think that's one that every cardinal is asking themselves in this moment. You know, inevitably, the church is mourning right now, but that question inevitably is being asked. It has to be asked, you know, by the cardinals who are going to elect Pope Francis's successor. And I think the overwhelming consensus, you know, it usually comes down to two things. I mean, it comes down to basically what do you want as individuals, you know? So everyone's answer to what comes next is going to be a little different. But it basically comes down to the question of, do you want continuity or discontinuity with the papacy that has just ended? Do they have a sense, the cardinals, that things were going in the right direction, that the church was doing well under his leadership? Or do they want to shift things and do something a little differently? And I think that there are going to be mixed reactions to that. Francis was a big personality. He was beloved by many, but he was also quite controversial for many as well. And so the cardinals are going to have to ask themselves what went well in this papacy and what didn't, and who is going to be a candidate that's apt to continue some of the things that Francis was loved for, you know, his embracing of the poor and the marginalized, you know, his push for justice and his emphasis on God's mercy, you know, but who can possibly also, you know, maybe do some damage control for the things that Francis was also controversial for. You know, he faced a lot of questions over, you know, doctrinal obscurity sometimes. People didn't think he was clear enough when it came down on that. You know, his efforts to reform and the church's pastoral approach oftentimes came under scrutiny. And so you're going to, you know, the cardinals are going to have to ask themselves, who's going to be able to, you know, perhaps smooth over the wrinkles that were created by Francis with some of, you know, his decisions, but also continue the legacy that, you know, the church and the world responded so positively to. So it's not an easy task, and it's something I imagine every single one of them are going to be thinking very carefully about over the next 10 days or so before we get into discussion about a conclave.
Those are all critical questions that no doubt that these cardinals had been asking themselves, I'm sure, not only given the conversations and the talk about possible resignation, but certainly because of the Holy Father's very delicate health state. Elise, Alan, thank you so much for your reporting. We'll let you go on what is undoubtedly a critical day for you there in Rome and at the Vatican as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
CNN Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb joins us now live with more. He's outside of St. Peter's Square. Christopher, you've been there speaking to the faithful. What are some of the what's some of the immediate reaction you're getting from people there?
Well, the reaction to the death of Pope Francis is coming in as taking time, I think, for people to process this news. There's obviously a lot of sadness because Pope Francis was an enormously popular pontiff. He was the people's pope who connected with so many different types of groups, of individuals, particularly the poorest, the refugees, migrants, those on the margins of society. And just yesterday on Sunday, Easter Sunday, he was out in the square of St. Peter's for the last time on the Pope Mobile, greeting people, and clearly then it was obvious that people loved this Pope. He delighted the crowds with his decision to come out to see them. It was obviously very difficult for Francis yesterday because he didn't seem well. He wasn't engaged in the normal way that he has been when we've seen him out in the crowds in previous times. But it was a mark of this Pope that he wanted to serve right until the end. There were some who speculated that Francis might resign when he was hospitalized for that 38-day period with double pneumonia. People thought he might decide to step down. That clearly wasn't his thinking. He wanted to go with his boots on. And he was even over the Easter weekend trying to participate in services as best he could. He obviously couldn't lead those services, but he came out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica for that one last time, the same balcony that he appeared for the first time when he was elected as Pope. The first Pope to call himself after St. Francis of Assisi, the saint who, of course, devoted himself to poverty, to care for creation, for dialogue with other faiths. All of these things were really important to Pope Francis. He took that inspiration from St. Francis of Assisi. He was also an outsider pope. He was the first pope in over 100 years to never have lived or studied in Rome before his election. That meant he was something of a disruptor. He shook up the church establishment. He refused to be scripted by the Vatican bureaucracy. He was his own man, and he was very clear that the church, the Catholic Church, needed to focus on the essentials of the Christian message. That is serving the poorest. He said he wanted a church for the poor, a poor church for the poor, going out to the margins, solidarity with migrants. He wanted to dialogue with other faiths. He built bridges with other religions, particularly those from the Muslim world. He had a sort of an unprecedented collaboration with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, and he also had a meeting with the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani in Iraq. So the Shia and Sunni leaders he met and got to know from the Muslim world. He was a tireless advocate for peace, repeatedly calling for peace in Ukraine and the Middle East. He tried to do his best to mediate in those conflicts. He really was a pope who gave everything during his just over 12-year pontificate. He's also sought to institute reforms in the Catholic Church, some of them not always received well. He wanted a church, particularly a church leadership, that was doing more to listen to ordinary Catholics, that was less disconnected from the needs of the people in the pews. And he also made some very important and significant steps when it came to welcoming gay Catholics, LGBTQ plus Catholics. He was the Pope who famously said, "Who am I to judge?" when it came to gay priests, and he offered blessings for same-sex couples. Now, people didn't all like that in the Catholic Church. They found that disturbing and disruptive. But Francis realized and he saw the need to communicate a message to not just those in the church, but to those outside of the church. Francis had a strong moral standing, not just among Catholics, but amongst all Christians, all different groups of Christians and different religious faiths. So Francis is a pope who has profoundly shaped the Catholic Church. He is also someone who has reformed the papacy. I mentioned St. Francis of Assisi and the importance of poverty. Francis took the decision not to live in the Apostolic Palace behind me here in St. Peter's, but to go and live in a guest house at the Santa Marta, which is where the news of his death was announced this morning. He decided to live in a more simple way, but also he lived in the Santa Marta guest house because it gave him access to people. The Santa Marta was a place where bishops and cardinals, other people would come through to stay on when they were coming to Rome for church business. He got a chance to meet people. There was a communal dining room in the Santa Marta where the Pope was seen having his meals. So people could, certainly in the early days, put down their tray with their food and sit next to the Pope and talk to him. There was an accessibility to Francis that we hadn't seen before. Now, I met the Pope on a number of occasions. I travelled with him several times, and I was always struck by how much of a good sense of humour he had. He would frequently joke with journalists and reporters, how comfortable he was in his own skin, and how much of a kind of clear-eyed leader he was of the church. He wasn't looking to simply appease and please those at the top level of the church, but to try and take the message of the church, of Christianity, out to as many people as possible. He was very much an evangelizing Pope. So really, I think people here in St. Peter's Square, as they come to terms with this news, will feel a sense of profound sadness for a people's Pope who was hugely popular and very much loved.
A beacon of compassion, humility, and spiritual courage. Those are the words from the Indian Prime Minister for Pope Francis, a tribute for the Holy Father. Christopher Lamb, thank you very much as you report there from the very same square where Pope Francis was just yesterday. before his death was confirmed this morning. We're joined now by Kaya Burgess. She's a religious affairs correspondent for The Times, joining us live now from London. Curious if you could tell us what you're hearing from your sources, certainly given his fragile state, not surprising, but what do we know about the circumstances of the Holy Father's death?
Well, I mean, very little at the moment beyond what was said this morning. We know that obviously he's been ill for a long time, and we also know that he was able to make appearances over Easter weekend. And so, you know, he managed to sort of hold on, I suppose, for Easter, which is clearly the central date in the Christian calendar. We still haven't actually heard the exact circumstances of exactly sort of how he passed away, what the sort of final kind of cause of death was at the moment, but I'm sure that will come.
What do we know about what we can expect in the coming days, especially from Vatican officials? Obviously, this is going to start this triggers a millennia-old process and tradition.
Well, the first step, of course, will be preparing for the funeral, which will take place, you know, fairly soon, and give a chance for there to be some sort of lying in state for people to probably pass by and sort of see the Pope. But also the preparations will be going on to get a huge number of cardinals gathered from around the world. All those under the age of 80 are eligible to vote in the conclave. And so the preparations will start taking place in more of a matter of kind of weeks, that will be, to gather them in the Sistine Chapel for the debates and for the vote, which all take place behind closed doors. From the outside, all we see of that, of course, is puffs of smoke from the chimney, which tell us whether a new pope has or has not been named. But the Carmelengo, who's former Bishop of Dallas, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who was born in Dublin, he was the man who announced the Pope's death this morning, and it's his job now to undertake the preparations for and then the management of the conclave to elect a successor.
A monumental task ahead. Kaya, finally, if you could just speak to the timing of all of this. It is, and you touched on it briefly, just the remarkable nature of the timing, that he went out working. He made very clear here that he did not want to stop up until the very end. His doctors had recommended that he take 2 months' time to rest and to at least limit those public appearances, and he did. But nonetheless, he was determined, so much so that as we see these pictures, as you and I speak, seeing him aboard that Pope-mobile, how does that speak to his determination to essentially work until the very end, to serve until the very end, I should say?
Well, it's a good question, because when Pope Benedict stepped down, people wondered whether that might set a precedent, in that popes have traditionally worked until they pass away in the job, and that Francis had maybe hinted earlier on in his papacy that perhaps if he got to a stage where his health was failing him and he didn't feel able to kind of carry out the duties of Pope, that perhaps he too might follow, and it might become a new standard even, potentially. But clearly in the last few years, when his health has been failing, he's had to miss various services. His breathing issues have meant he's had to ask other people to read his sermons or speeches for him in various situations. He has shown no sign. And it's clear he has felt that the job is something that he wants to continue until the very end. Perhaps he wanted to do more to secure his legacy. It's been a very busy time. I think he's wanted to push through some of his reforms in the church to do with, you know, having synods to govern things, and perhaps he was thinking about the future as well. And his legacy, of course, will, as to what his legacy will be, that will be cemented to a degree by who follows him. Will it be someone like-minded who'll carry on his sort of attitude and his direction, or someone who'll want to reverse it? And so he's been appointing sort of like-minded people to join the College of Cardinals. So he obviously just felt like his work was ongoing, and it wasn't something he wanted to give up at any point, and keep on going for as long as he could.
Now, you pose some very important questions, but for now, it's about mourning, certainly. But nonetheless, those questions that you raise, I'm sure that those cardinals have been at least asking themselves some of that because of what had been Pope Francis's health. Thank you so much for your time, Kay. I really appreciate you, religious affairs correspondent for The Times. Stay with us, much more breaking news after the break as we continue to follow developments out of the Vatican, where officials have confirmed the death of Pope Francis at 88.
Grief isn't talked about much, but that's what my podcast is all about. Join me and my guests for a new season with new conversations.
Pitch its tent amongst the most suffering of people, the people who were suffering the most. He wanted a church amongst the people, and a church focused on service and humility. Now, you know, people often look at the Vatican and they look at the Catholic Church and they see these extraordinary basilicas and cathedrals, and they see incredible history and they see magnificent liturgies and vestments. But Pope Francis, taking the name of St. Francis of Assisi, wanted a church that was focused on simplicity, on the core values of the Christian message. Of course, St. Francis of Assisi was a famous saint who focused on poverty, care for creation, simplicity, humility, and this is what Pope Francis sought to bring to the church during his just over 12-year papacy. And Francis, as Pope, sought to embody those values of St. Francis of Assisi. I mentioned the environment earlier, and the Pope, of course, wrote a very important encyclical about protecting the planet and protecting the environment, protecting the natural world. It was a landmark encyclical that really shifted official Catholic teaching on the topic, and that was something that he raised during his time in his visit to the United States in 2015, when he went to the lawn of the White House and spoke and met with President Obama when he addressed both houses, where he emphasized that importance of protection of the environment, but also migration. Migrants was a key concern for Pope Francis, and just before he went out onto the balcony yesterday, he met with Vice President J.D. Vance. And of course, Pope Francis had been very critical of the Trump administration immigration policy. So basically with Francis, it was a question of he wanted to serve right until the end. And I think we've seen that with, you know, yesterday he was out on the square on Easter Sunday, the high point of the church's calendar. And then today we have this news that really has come as quite a shock, because we had been told by the Vatican the Pope was slowly improving. Although, of course, as I said, those of us who followed Francis closely did notice that he did not seem as engaged yesterday as he normally would. He seemed to be struggling. But this was a mark of this Pope, that he wanted to serve right until the very end. Paulo.
Christopher, I'm curious if you could speak to the sudden nature of the Holy Father's death here. A reminder to viewers that we were just weeks into his prescribed 2 months of rest that the doctors had recommended for the Holy Father to limit his public appearances. And as you made clear, despite that, he was determined to keep that public presence as much as he possibly and physically could. So if you could just speak to the sudden nature of the news that now Catholics around the world are waking up to the day after the Easter weekend.
Yes, well, I think most people will know that Francis had been hospitalized with pneumonia in both of his lungs, that he had almost died on 2 occasions, that it had been a very serious health crisis, and that basically Francis's general health wasn't in the best of condition. I mean, he's 88 years old, and he's had other health challenges. He's was largely confined to a wheelchair. He has had other hospitalizations for respiratory problems. He's had a history of those respiratory infections, and he had part of a right lung removed as a young man, and so he was vulnerable to these bronchial infections. I mean, the bottom line is that the Pope effectively avoided death narrowly.
Coverage of the death of Pope Francis. I'm Paul of Sandoval, New York. For more continuing coverage, I want to bring in my colleague now, Adi Cornish, who's standing by in Washington as we continue to cover the death of Pope Francis. Adi?
Thank you so much, Polo. Pope Francis, of course, the 266th head of the Roman Catholic Church, has died at age 88. The Vatican says he passed away at 7:35 local time this morning, with a statement reading in part, his whole life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. His passing comes just a day after Easter Sunday, where the Pope gave the traditional Easter blessing from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, delighting crowds of worshipers. It was his most high-profile appearance since being released from a Rome hospital almost a month ago, where the Pope spent weeks receiving treatment for double pneumonia. Francis became the first Latin American Pope in 2013 and was one of the oldest popes in the Church's history. Now, throughout his papacy, he was a vocal champion for the poor, for migrants, and for the environment. In the Vatican statement, Cardinal Kevin Farrell said, quote, "He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and the most marginalized." CNN Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb joins us here with more. He's actually now just outside St. Peter's Square. And Chris, can you just start with the gathering? I'm sure more and more people, as they're hearing, are appearing in the square.
Well, that's right. People are gathering in St. Peter's Square at the moment. There's, of course, it's a Jubilee year in Rome and many people are visiting. The news is beginning to filter through to people, and it is news that is being greeted with sadness because, of course, Pope Francis was a hugely popular pope. He was the people's pope who connected with so many different groups, particularly those on the margins of society, the migrants, refugees, the poorest people, the homeless. I mean, just where I'm sitting here, there are a number of homeless who gather each day, and Francis set up facilities to help those homeless who are sleeping rough. Now, Francis was a pope who tried to put into action the values of the Christian message. So, as I said, the importance of service, but also humility and poverty. He took the name Saint Francis of Assisi, a saint who was devoted to those values, and he himself, Francis, lived a very simple lifestyle. He did not live in the apostolic palace behind me, but in the Santa Marta guest house, a place for people who wanted to visit Rome on church business, a place where he originally stayed as Cardinal Bergoglio before he was elected Pope Francis. He stayed in the Santa Marta and remained there. And he decided to not live in the palace, but in the simple guest house, because he also wanted to have access to people. It was very important that he could meet and talk to people and be a very accessible Pope. And just yesterday, Easter Sunday, Francis was out on the Pope-mobile greeting the crowds, despite clearly suffering from the effects of this double pneumonia. He wasn't his usual self yesterday. It was clear he wasn't engaged, particularly in the crowds, as he usually is. Now, Francis, as we know, was the first pope from Latin America. He was very much an outsider figure. He had not studied or lived in Rome before his election, and that meant he shook up the Church and the Vatican establishment. He refused to be scripted by the Roman Curia, the Church's central administration. He's very much his own man. You know, his first trip outside of Rome was to Lampedusa, the island in southern Italy where migrants were coming in from North Africa, risking their lives and dying in the process. And the Pope decided he would go to Lampedusa as his first visit. And it was said that the Pope had called Alitalia Airways to book a ticket for himself on the plane. And when Alitalia heard that someone called Jorge Bergoglio was trying to book a ticket, they called the Vatican and said, hang on, what's going on here? And in the end, the Vatican had to organize an official trip. But he had that sort of restlessness, that desire, that determination to serve, to break convention. He didn't always follow protocol. He was a pope of surprises. You know, when he announced the names of new cardinals, he wouldn't tell the cardinals, he wouldn't tell anyone. He would announce them from behind me at the Vatican in the Apostolic Palace. And he'd often choose cardinals who were not the obvious candidates. He chose bishops who were serving in places like Tonga or Haiti or the Central African Republic or Mongolia, places that had never had cardinals before. He thoroughly reformed the College of Cardinals, the body who will be tasked with electing his successor. He internationalized it, and he took away the ecclesiastical career ladder that meant that if you were appointed as an archbishop to a certain diocese or church, you would then automatically become a cardinal. And now Francis changed all that. he shook things up in that respect. And that did see him face quite a lot of opposition. He was, of course, a pope who was very pastoral and compassionate. He shifted the Catholic Church's approach when it came to same-sex relationships and LGBTQ+ Catholics. He offered blessings to gay couples. He famously said, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about a gay priest. He shifted the approach. He didn't change the fundamental doctrines or teachings, but he demanded a more pastoral strategy or pastoral approach. He insisted that people who are gay are children of God and should be included and welcomed. He insisted time and again that the church is open to everyone. Todos, 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 he said at World Youth Day in Portugal, where a huge gathering of young people. He said the church is open to everyone. And that was really his message, a pope of the people, for the people. And I think there's a lot of sadness here in the square as the news of Francis's death announced this morning by Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Irish-born but US naturalized citizen who is a cardinal in Rome, the former Bishop of Dallas. He announced the news this morning that Pope Francis has died.
Chris, thanks so much. And we have some more news now, which is that the White House has done a social media post saying, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis," with the image there, of course, of both the president and J.D. Vance, who is Catholic, meeting with the Pope. I'm joined now by Kim Daniels. We're bringing her in because she's the director of the Georgetown Initiative on Catholic and Social Thought. First of all, thank you for joining us on this morning. I think it's a sad day for so many people in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was, how significant it was for him to be named Pope in the first place?
Just a remarkable moment. I was there in St. Peter's Square when Pope Francis was named Pope, and I just can't tell you the feeling. It's in many ways parallel to the feeling I have now, and I know so many Catholics. It was so hopeful, so forward-looking, and just a moment of real joy as we welcomed this Pope who had chosen the name Francis, a man of peace, a man of rebuilding the church, a man who was forward-looking, and he really had a heart for the poor. St. Francis did, and of course we saw that with Pope Francis throughout his papacy. I think the feeling that Catholics have right now, of course, is one of mourning the death of Pope Francis, who was just such a remarkable leader at this moment in time. And also, again, one of hope that again, on Easter Monday, Pope Francis, he went out giving a blessing to all yesterday on Easter Sunday, the holiest day of the year for us. And really a forward-looking church that is there for the poor and vulnerable, a church of mercy and accompaniment.
When he took over, he said he would approach the Catholic Church more like a field hospital. Can you talk about what he meant by that and how that played out?
That was exactly the theme, I think, that we saw throughout his church, his papacy, that it was a field hospital church that went out to the margins. So he said, it's not about sort of staying enclosed inside the walls of the church. That would be a sick church, he said, if we just stayed within our doors. But it was more like a field hospital after a battle. We were called to go forth to heal wounds first, and then discuss doctrine, and then discuss harder issues, right? But the first thing is to heal people's wounds. And I think that's what you saw with Pope Francis in his travels, going around the world to the places that had been forgotten, in his outreach to people who were marginalized, who were poor, who were, as he said, lying wounded by the roadside, like in the story of the Good Samaritan, a parable that was so close to his heart and that he recalled us to time and time again.
He also approached the issue of corruption in the Catholic Church. Can you talk about what that meant in reality, how he affected how it was run?
Sure. I think Pope Francis, really, his legacy is one of both spiritual renewal and structural reform, offering this dynamic, hopeful vision that I've talked about. And of course, there are many challenges in the church, right? And you point out some of them. He his efforts have been to implement significant structural reforms in the church to make it more responsive and more effective in its mission. And in doing that, responding to corruption, responding to the clergy sexual abuse crisis, and in many ways advancing Vatican II, Vatican Council II's vision through reform. Obviously made many steps forward here, but also so much left to do at the same time.
As we mentioned, your Georgetown initiative focuses on Catholic social thought, he was very much a political pope in a way, very right until the last minute. We saw him in a photo with Vice President J.D. Vance, right, who had spoken, making some interpretations about theology. Can you talk about his legacy in that respect, what you're going to be thinking about over the next few days?
I think I would say, first of all, yesterday, the way he approached J.D. Vance, frankly, was as a pastor, right? He gave him gifts for his children, Easter eggs for his children. He met with this new convert to the church on Easter Sunday. And I think that that is the first lens through which we should look through that meeting. And then at the same time, I think it's important to note that Pope Francis really, really called us to be a church that both works past the kind of divisions that we see and that engages in political life, that knows we're not called to retreat, but as Catholics called to be present in public conversations, called to be in the world, as you said, be a field hospital out in the world. And that means sticking up for the poorest of the poor, for those who are forgotten, for migrants, for refugees, for, again, those who are suffering. And I think those are messages that Pope Francis brought to every political leader.
Again, that's Kim Daniels, director of the Georgetown Initiative on Catholic Social Thought. Thank you for your time. We're joined now by our international diplomatic editor, Nick Robertson, who, of course, has been monitoring the reaction coming in from around the world.
Yes, and I think, as you were just discussing there about the meeting with J.D. Vance just yesterday and coming to him as a pastor, world leaders who'd ever come in contact with Pope Francis understood that this was a man who wasn't going to be afraid to tell them where he thought perhaps things could be better. And that's what I think we're getting a sense of today when we're hearing from leaders, from Emmanuel Macron speaking about the joy and hope that the Pope brought to the poorer people of the world. And this is a theme that we've heard people talk about in terms of Pope Francis, about how he wanted to care for the weak, how he wanted to improve interfaith dialogue, how he wanted to address the difficult issues of our time, be it immigration, issues that beset world leaders around the globe. We've heard this morning from Friedrich Merz, who is the German Chancellor in waiting, in essence, and he talks about the Pope's tireless commitment to the weakest members of society and bringing justice and reconciliation. And Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, speaks about, and I think again this gets to the interfaith area, the fact that the Pope set such a standard in compassion in humanity. He reached, as your last guest was saying, he reached beyond the faith. And this is what Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission President, speaks today. He reached millions of people with his humanity beyond the Catholic faith. Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, has spoken today about his respect of the Pope's compassion and humanity. We've heard from the Israeli president today, Isaac Herzog, talking about, again, the importance of that interfaith dialogue to bring understanding between different communities. But the overarching picture that emerges here are leaders who absolutely understood his compassion, absolutely understood that he wanted to reach to the poorer and make their lives better, and would communicate that. And this was such an active Pope who traveled so much to meet so many people, the disenfranchised, but he didn't forget to speak to their leaders. And of course, that's what we witnessed yesterday with J.D. Vance.
How much was he kind of a representative also of the global South, which, of course, he was the first Pope from Latin America, born to Italian parents. But how did that influence how he conducted his papacy?
He came to it with the understanding and being part of a poorer, a vast population that just had less opportunity than much of the developed world. And this gave him that grounding, and that sense of the vast amount of humanity that needed, the church's mission to help them in their daily lives by pastoral care and understanding, but also to try to help improve their lives in the broader sense. So I think this is clearly what influenced and grounded him, and it was something again. And I think I think one of your contributors just mentioned the fact that he wasn't educated in the traditional way in Rome. His education came from a different part of the world with a different perspective and a less prescribed set of views, and surrounded by people of less good fortune than perhaps some of the gilded halls that are frequented in the capitals around the world. So yes, this absolutely was fundamental to him forming that picture, and it was something that he brought into all churches, be they small congregations in the UK, huge churches in other parts of the world. He brought that message of humanity, of helping those around you, the poorer, and of course that touched a huge chord because many Catholics are drawn for this reason to the faith.
That's CNN's Nick Robertson taking in all of the response from world leaders today with the death of Pope Francis. He, of course, died at the age of 88. That was announced by the Vatican. He had also been essentially the oldest pope to have served. We're going to talk next with CNN senior international correspondent Ben Wiedemann. He joins us live. Ben, this in a way, not that it wasn't a surprise, but the Pope had been in ill health for so long, even prior to the double pneumonia. Can you talk about what it's been like the last couple of years?
The last couple of years, Audrey, we've seen him going into hospital basically every year. Clearly, at 88 years old, he was not in good health, but his health was slowly deteriorating. He had mobility problems. He had abdominal surgery. It was clearly mounting. And certainly when in mid-February he went into Rome's Gemelli Hospital and was soon afterwards diagnosed with double pneumonia, it certainly seemed that his days were numbered, that this was a pope who pushed himself very hard, a pope who, despite the urging of doctors and his advisors, really did not relent in pursuing his goals. And therefore, I was at Gemelli Hospital when, on his last day there, he appeared on a balcony and then drove away and waved to the crowd from his Fiat Cinquecento as he returned to the Vatican. It was thought that perhaps the worst had passed, that the Pope was beginning to recover. The doctors had urged him to rest for at least 2 months, to not do too much to put a strain on his health. But what we saw yesterday was real evidence of a pope who was insistent on resuming as much as possible his activities. So even though basically we were never quite sure whether he would appear or whether he would meet people. For instance, recently King Charles and Queen Camilla were here. It wasn't clear if he would meet them, but out of the blue, he did meet them briefly. J.D. Vance showed up in Rome recently, and yet again, it was a case of we're not sure if he's going to meet him, but in the end, he did. Certainly, it appears to have been his last public act before passing away, was to meet the U.S. Vice President. So he really, to the very last moment, tried to serve, to do his job, to show that he was active, that he was concerned. And to his very last moment, he was expressing concern over the situation. For instance, he said yesterday when, or rather it was read for him from St. Peter's Square, he said, "I think of the people of Gaza and the Christian community in particular, where the terrible conflict continues to cause death and destruction and create a dramatic and deplorable humanitarian situation." So he clearly was was concerned to the very last moment to express, to remind the world of conflicts like Gaza, which have sort of become, in a sense, for the media and political leaders who seem to have forgotten it altogether. And therefore, he was somebody who did not drop the ball, did not get distracted by other things. He was a man focused on, as we've heard my colleagues say, the poorest of the poor, the downtrodden, the forgotten in this world. Audie?
And of course, we heard earlier someone describe him as the Pope of surprises. And it's, I think, in the end, this is also something that has taken people off guard, especially with him appearing yesterday. What more are you hearing in terms of reaction from international leaders or other areas?
Well, certainly just to start locally, here in Rome, we heard the bells ringing, church bells ringing across the city as news spread that the Pope had passed away. Italians I know were in shock because many people thought he was getting better. He left the hospital, he was out and about. Yesterday, the assumption was that even though he was 88 in frail health, that he was trying to resume his normal activities, and therefore it really came out of the blue. Keep in mind, Audie, that today is a holiday. It's known as Pasquetta. It's the day after Easter, a day when normally people here go out to enjoy the spring weather, go to the beach, go out for picnics, go to the parks. It's a day of where families get together. And suddenly the atmosphere is completely different. The weather's nice, but certainly there is a sort of a cloud of sadness that hovers over Rome and probably extends well beyond Rome. In terms of world reaction, certainly we've heard from the usual political leaders expressing condolences for the death of the Pope. But I think we need to go beyond those people and think of the many people around the world, not just Catholics, but others who have looked to the Pope as a voice of compassion, of concern for those who are often forgotten. I've basically made a career reporting from the Middle East, and I can tell you that many Muslims look at the Pope as one of the few leaders left in the world who seems to have compassion, concern for the others, those who are normally not the focus of attention, somebody who looks at global conflict and doesn't judge upon the basis of religion or national origin, but simply the humanity of those who are the victims of these conflicts and injustices. Audie?
Thank you so much for speaking with us. And of course, CNN's breaking news coverage of the death of Pope Francis continues. We'll return after this quick break.
This is CNN.
Fire of assault.
Right, but you can see the discrepancies in the violence at the same time, Harish, because clearly the Air Force
values of the Christian message. So, as I said, the importance of service, but also humility and poverty. He took the name Saint Francis of Assisi, a saint.
For more continuing coverage, I want to bring in my colleague now, Audie Cornish, who's standing by in Washington as we continue to cover the death of Pope Francis. Audie?
Thank you so much, Polo. Pope Francis, of course, the 266th head of the Roman Catholic Church, has died at age 88. The Vatican says he passed away at 7:35 local time this morning, with a statement reading in part, "His whole life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church." His passing comes just a day after Easter Sunday, where the Pope gave the traditional Easter blessing from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, delighting crowds of worshipers. It was his most high-profile appearance since being released from a Rome hospital almost a month ago, where the Pope spent weeks receiving treatment for double pneumonia. Francis became the first Latin American pope in 2013 and was one of the oldest popes in the Church's history. Now, throughout his papacy, he was a vocal champion for the poor, for migrants, and for the environment. In the Vatican statement, Cardinal Kevin Farrell said, quote, "He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and the most marginalized." CNN Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb joins us here with more. He's actually now just outside St. Peter's Square. And Chris, can you just start with the gathering? I'm sure more and more people, as they're hearing, are appearing in the square.
Well, that's right. People are gathering in St. Peter's Square at the moment. There's, of course, it's a Jubilee year in Rome and many people are visiting. The news is beginning to filter through to people, and it is news that is being greeted with sadness because, of course, Pope Francis was a hugely popular pope. He was the people's pope who connected with so many different groups, particularly those on the margins of society, the migrants, refugees, the poorest people, the homeless. I mean, just where I'm sitting here, there are a number of homeless who gather each day, and Francis set up facilities to help those homeless who are sleeping rough. Now, Francis was a pope who tried to put into action the values of the Christian message. So, as I said, the importance of service, but also humility and poverty. He took the name Saint Francis of Assisi, a saint who was devoted to those values, and he himself, Francis, lived a very simple lifestyle. He did not live in the apostolic palace behind me, but in the Santa Marta guest house, a place for people who wanted to visit Rome on church business, a place where he originally stayed as Cardinal Bergoglio before he was elected Pope Francis. He stayed in the Santa Marta and remained there. And he decided to not live in the palace, but in the simple guest house, because he also wanted to have access to people. It was very important that he could meet and talk to people and be a very accessible Pope. And just yesterday, Easter Sunday, Francis was out on the Pope-mobile greeting the crowds, despite clearly suffering from the effects of this double pneumonia. He wasn't his usual self yesterday. It was clear he wasn't engaged, particularly in the crowds, as he usually is. Now, Francis, as we know, was the first pope from Latin America. He was very much an outsider figure. He had not studied or lived in Rome before his election, and that meant he shook up the Church and the Vatican establishment. He refused to be scripted by the Roman Curia, the Church's central administration. He's very much his own man. You know, his first trip outside of Rome was to Lampedusa, the island in southern Italy where migrants were coming in from North Africa, risking their lives and dying in the process. And the Pope decided he would go to Lampedusa as his first visit. And it was said that the Pope had called Alitalia Airways to book a ticket for himself on the plane. And when Alitalia heard that someone called Jorge Bergoglio was trying to book a ticket, they called the Vatican and said, hang on, what's going on here? And in the end, the Vatican had to organize an official trip. But he had that sort of restlessness, that desire, that determination to serve, to break convention. He didn't always follow protocol. He was a pope of surprises. You know, when he announced the names of new cardinals, he wouldn't tell the cardinals, he wouldn't tell anyone. He would announce them from behind me at the Vatican in the Apostolic Palace. And he'd often choose cardinals who were not the obvious candidates. He chose bishops who were serving in places like Tonga or Haiti or the Central African Republic or Mongolia, places that had never had cardinals before. He thoroughly reformed the College of Cardinals, the body who will be tasked with electing his successor. He internationalized it, and he took away the ecclesiastical career ladder that meant that if you were appointed as an archbishop to a certain diocese or church, you would then automatically become a cardinal. And now Francis changed all that. He shook things up in that respect. And that did see him face quite a lot of opposition. He was, of course, a pope who was very pastoral and compassionate. He shifted the Catholic Church's approach when it came to same-sex relationships and LGBTQ+ Catholics. He offered blessings to gay couples. He famously said, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about a gay priest. He shifted the approach. He didn't change the fundamental doctrines or teachings, but he demanded a more pastoral strategy or pastoral approach. He insisted that people who are gay, a 38-day hospitalization. But this morning the news was announced by Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who is the Camerlengo, who has the job of overseeing the process of certifying the death of a pope. He announced that news. Cardinal Farrell is the former Bishop of Dallas in the United States. He's Irish-born but a US naturalized citizen. He announced that death this morning. Now, I think for many people, Francis was a very accessible pope. He was a pope who wanted the church to go out to the people. He didn't want the church to stay stuck in its gilded basilicas. He didn't want a church that projected an image of being remote or being disconnected. He wanted a church that connected with people, and his big focuses were on things such as migration. He was a strong advocate for the plight of migrants. His first visit out of Rome was to the island of Lampedusa to show his solidarity with the people risking their lives from North Africa to arrive on the island of Lampedusa. He was also a tireless advocate for the poor, the poorest in society. He wanted, he said, a poor church for the poor. He himself did not live in the palace of the popes behind me, but in the guest house of the Casa Santa Marta, where the news of his death was announced this morning. This guest house is a simple residence for people who come to Rome on church business, and it's also used for cardinals before they elect a pope in a conclave. But Francis decided to remain in that guest house, to adopt a simple lifestyle, as often seen in a simple Ford car rather than a big SUV or a big motorcade. That was very important to him. He wanted a church that served, that was poor, that was humble. Also a tireless advocate for the environment. He wrote a very important encyclical on the importance of protecting the environment. He, of course, was the first pope from Latin America and the first pope to call himself after St. Francis of Assisi, a saint who was known for his radical commitment to poverty, to care for creation, and to dialogue with other faiths. Now, Francis was one of those popes, I think, who will be remembered for a long time. There is a strong sense of sadness, a somber atmosphere in St. Peter's as people come to terms with the news that Pope Francis has died.
And Christopher, we're going to pause for a moment and hear those bells ringing out. Those bells, of course, ringing over the death of Pope Francis. Christopher, I want to follow up on something you mentioned. You mentioned the Camerlengo and the cardinal from Dallas. Can you talk about the role of that figure in the next couple of days? Because, of course, there's going to be a funeral, and how will this process work?
That's right. Cardinal Farrell has a very important role now as Camerlengo. He effectively is running the Catholic Church's central administration during this period between the papal interregnum, the period between two popes. So Cardinal Farrell will effectively be in charge of the day-to-day running of the Vatican. He has limited powers in the sense he can't just act like a pope, but he is effectively keeping the administration going during that time. He is also the one who was tasked with certifying the death of the pope this morning, and of course overseeing the prayers, the liturgy that takes place when a pope dies. We're expecting the arrangements we put in place for people to pay their respects to Pope Francis. Pope Francis, before he died, did simplify the papal funeral rituals. Things will be simpler. There won't be, he won't be laid out in state in the same way that his predecessor Benedict was. He'll be laid in a coffin, an open casket for people to pay their tributes to. And Cardinal Farrell will be tasked with overseeing that. So at this moment, a former Bishop of Dallas, a US citizen, Cardinal is effectively running the Catholic Church's central administration during this time as the Camerlengo of the Roman Curia.
And of course, I'm even hearing that the Pope has a simpler plan for his coffin. And I think it just talks about it says something about how much of the trappings of the papacy he rejected in order to have this sort of theology of mercy.
Well, mercy was really at the centre point of Francis's ministry. He called for a more compassionate and merciful approach to divorced and remarried Catholics. He wanted to allow them to return to receiving the sacraments. He also pioneered or insisted on a different approach to LGBTQ plus Catholics. He offered things to same-sex couples. He was the Pope who said, "Who am I to judge?" when he was asked about a gay priest. So he really shifted the conversation on that in a very dramatic way. I mean, before Francis, a number of documents from the Vatican have been released on homosexuality, which really caused a lot of hurt to gay people. And Francis shifted that in a profound way during his pontificate, because he believed in the importance of emphasizing mercy. He said, the name of God is mercy. And he would often say to people, it's not God who gets tired of forgiving, but people who get tired of asking for forgiveness. It was all part of that desire from the Pope for the Church to go out to into the world, to be less constrained by some of the customs that he felt could be restricting the Church. He wanted to say that the Catholic Church was open to everyone, and that was something that he repeatedly emphasized. And he did make some profound changes to the makeup of the College of Cardinals. Now, they are the group who will be tasked with electing the next Pope. And Francis dramatically internationalized that body. I mean, he never told anyone who he was going to make a cardinal before he announced them. He used to announce them from the balcony of the Apostolic Palace. And he would choose, he's chosen cardinals from different parts of the world, such as Tonga, Haiti, Central African Republic, Mongolia, not the usual places. So that will be fascinating as we get closer to another papal election.
Okay, that's CNN's Christopher Lamb. I want to turn it over to you, John, in New York.
All right, thanks so much, Audie. With us now is Father Patrick Mary Briscoe. He's the editor of a Catholic newspaper out of Columbus, Ohio. Father, thank you so much for being with us this morning. And I know it is a solemn morning for Catholics around the world. Give us your thoughts on the passing of Pope Francis, what his papacy meant.
Good morning, John. Yes, I'm sorry to be with you on this occasion. To be sure, all of us Catholics throughout the world, people of goodwill, are joining us in praying for the peaceful repose of Pope. It's an astonishing thing to wake up just after having celebrated Easter, the beautiful highlight of our church's liturgical year, to wake up and find this news about the death of our spiritual leader. It's a very, very tragic first day of the Easter season. So I think many Catholics are feeling what I felt this morning, which is a combination of sorrow and frankly of shock, because we had been seeing such a recovery, such a notable and marked recovery, in fact, of Pope Francis's good health. So our immediate response as a church to this news, of course, is great sorrow and praying for Pope Francis, for his peaceful repose, and in gratitude for his ministry and his leadership of our church.
He was a champion of the poor. He was a champion of migrants around the world. What changes do you think he brought to the church that will endure?
One of the marks of Pope Francis's papacy is that he believed that God was a God of surprises. He said this often, and he would say it with a bit of a smile sometimes. And Pope Francis himself was certainly a man of great surprises. We saw many surprises. So I think we oughtn't be too shocked then that we would be surprised even by the way that he died, which is very different from the passing of Pope St. John Paul II, where all of us watched for days and where we were really prepared. I think Pope Francis' death in this hidden way is something that reflects the way that he took on, the way that he shouldered, the way that he carried the Petrine ministry, which was in a more hidden way. Pope Francis' papacy, of course, is marked by this notable trend to simplicity, the many ways he simplified the papal office, the many ways he reached out and emphasized especially the care of the poor, the stewardship of the earth, with documents like Laudato Si encouraging Catholics to take seriously a call to a renewed environmental stewardship. Pope Francis also had a deep spirituality that came through in many notable ways. Because he was a member of the Society of Jesus, he was especially devoted to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And so this spiritual turn, the spiritual emphasis of Pope Francis came to renew, I think, a lot of traditional devotion actually in many people. And that was another surprise from the papacy of Pope Francis. I think today many Catholics will be mourning his loss. Certainly will be praying for him, but also are looking towards the future. Just this weekend in Rome, there was supposed to be a great celebration, the canonization of Carlo Acutis. Well, many of these things on Rome will be on hold, will be reorganized, because of course the whole church now has to pause and to mourn and to share the legacy of our late Holy Father, of the late Pope Francis.
Father, stand by for just a moment, because we're seeing these images of St. Peter's Square, listening to the bells ringing there, watching these people in mourning the day after they were there celebrating Easter. Just stay with us 1 second, Father. Father, you mentioned the Society of Jesus. Of course, Pope Francis, the first Jesuit pope, also the first pope from Latin America, the global south, as it were, and in so many ways shifting the focus, I think, of the church perhaps southward. That is where the church seems to be growing the most. What will that legacy be?
Undoubtedly, Pope Francis was very attentive to the needs of the church in the global south. And you can look at all the data and you can see what's been happening in Latin America, what's been happening in Africa. This decentralization of the church by Pope Francis, by choosing cardinals, for example, from the far corners of the world, certainly has changed the way that the leadership of the church speaks about the church. It's a look wide. Pope Francis always spoke of going to the margins, to the peripheries, to bring in those who are less engaged, but with an apostolic zeal, an evangelical zeal. That means that Pope Francis wanted people to know Jesus and to become Catholic. He really had an outward focus and a great love for the church. That was one of his first documents, in fact, was called The Joy of the Gospel, John. And I think a lot of people, when they remember Pope Francis, will remember especially those early days. Again, we've been talking about this news as coming as a great shock. The Pope made many public appearances lately, presenting himself. Of course, he met with the Vice President of the United States, with Vice President J.D. Vance. So the news, again, really has shocked the world, has taken us all by great surprise here to hear this news that he's passed.
Father Patrick Mary Briscoe, editor of the Sunday, our Sunday Visitor out of Columbus, Ohio. I really do appreciate your words this morning, helping us understand the impact of the man, the reign of his papacy, the impact it will have for generations to come. Father, thank you. Of course, we're all waking up to the news that just after Easter Sunday, Pope Francis has passed away at the age of 88. A dozen years in the papacy, Audie, one that I think will be remembered for having a huge, huge impact. A very different pope, a very different papacy.
Yes, absolutely. Striking from beginning to end, given even how he came to the papacy after a surprise retirement. And ever since then, he has been off and running with changing the direction of the church in so many ways. We're going to hear more about that today as we hear world reaction to this news. We're going to hear more from the Vatican itself. Of course, as the Catholic Church mourns the death of Pope Francis, what is going to happen next? We're going to be back with our continuing coverage of the death of Pope Francis.
On the sandy dirt pitch in Abidjan.
And it's, I think, in the end, this is also something that has taken people off guard, especially with him appearing yesterday What more are you hearing in terms of reaction from international leaders or other areas?
Hospitalization, but this morning the news was announced by Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who is the Camerlengo, who has the job of overseeing the process of certifying the death of a pope. He announced that news. Cardinal Farrell is the former Bishop of Dallas in the United States. He's Irish-born but a US naturalized citizen. He announced that death this morning. Now, I think for many people, Francis was a very accessible pope. He was a pope who wanted the church to go out to the people. He didn't want the church to stay stuck in its gilded basilicas. He didn't want a church that projected an image of being remote or being disconnected. He wanted a church that connected with people. And his big focuses were on things such as migration. He was a strong advocate for the plight of migrants. His first visit out of Rome was to the island of Lampedusa to show his solidarity with the people risking their lives from North Africa to arrive on the island of Lampedusa. He was also a tireless advocate for the poor, the poorest in society. He wanted, he said, a poor church for the poor. He himself did not live in the palace of the popes behind me, but in the guest house of the Casa Santa Marta, where the news of his death was announced this morning. This guest house is a simple residence for people who come to Rome on church business. And it's also used for cardinals before they elect a pope in a conclave. But Francis decided to remain in that guest house, to adopt a simple lifestyle. It's often seen in a simple Ford car rather than a big SUV or a big motorcade. That was very important to him. He wanted a church that served, that was poor, that was humble. Also a tireless advocate for the environment. He wrote a very important encyclical on the importance of protecting the environment. He, of course, was the first pope from Latin America and the first pope to call himself after St. Francis of Assisi, a saint who was known for his radical commitment to poverty, to care for creation, and to dialogue with other faiths. Now, Francis was one of those popes, I think, who will be remembered for a long time. There is a strong sense of sadness, a somber atmosphere in St. Peter's as people come to terms with the news that Pope Francis has died.
And Christopher, we're going to pause for a moment and hear those bells ringing out. Those bells, of course, ringing over the death of Pope Francis. Christopher, I want to follow up on something you mentioned. You mentioned the Camerlengo and the cardinal from Dallas. Can you talk about the role of that figure in the next couple of days? Because, of course, there's going to be a funeral, and how will this process work?
That's right. Cardinal Farrell has a very important role now as Camerlengo. He effectively is running the Catholic Church's central administration during this period between the papal interregnum, the period between two popes. So Cardinal Farrell will effectively be in charge of the day-to-day running of the Vatican. He has limited powers in the sense he can't just act like a pope, but he is effectively keeping the administration going during that time. He is also the one who was tasked with certifying the death of the pope this morning, and of course overseeing the prayers, the liturgy that takes place when a pope dies. We're expecting the arrangements we put in place for people to pay their respects to Pope Francis. Pope Francis, before he died, did simplify the papal funeral rituals. Things will be simpler. There won't be, he won't be laid out in state in the same way that his predecessor Benedict was. He'll be laid in a coffin, an open casket for people to pay their tributes to. And Cardinal Farrell will be tasked with overseeing that. So at this moment, a former Bishop of Dallas, a US citizen, is
Cardinal is effectively running the Catholic Church's central administration during this time as the Camerlengo of the Roman Curia.
And of course, I'm even hearing that the Pope has a simpler plan for his coffin. And I think it just talks about, it says something about how much of the trappings of the papacy he rejected in order to have this sort of, there is that conversation about a conclave in the next Pope.
Yes, the Chamberlain or Camerlengo, Kevin Farrell, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, was the man who announced Pope Francis's death this morning, and his first steps are going to be to remove the papal ring from Pope Francis's finger and seal his study and apartment in the Casa Santa Marta, which is the Spartan guest house that Pope Francis chose to live in, as opposed to the rather sumptuous apostolic apartments that popes normally live in. And obviously, they haven't set a date yet for the funeral, but it is going to be clearly a very large event. It will take time to organize, to send out invitations, and to make preparations for that. But in the meantime, the invitations will be going out to 250 cardinals around the world to come to Rome to attend first the funeral, and then, of course, there's going to be the conclave, where they will be kept in seclusion to ponder who will be the next pope, where they will be voting, perhaps repeatedly, on to finally come to a decision as to who will be the next pontiff. But this is really, we are at the very beginning of a long and complicated process of transition from the Pope who is now passed away to the next Pope. But obviously this is, like I said, the beginning of a very old process that Rome has seen many times before. But at the moment, really what we're doing, I think the people in Rome and beyond, obviously, are absorbing the shock of the news of the passing of Pope Francis, given that, of course, that he was out and about yesterday in St. Peter's Square in the Pope Mobile. Yesterday afterwards, he did meet U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. It's a shock because, of course, he spent weeks and weeks starting in mid-February at Rome's Gemelli Hospital. And I was there when he appeared on the balcony the day he left, and then was driven away in his Fiat Cinquecento. And the assumption was he was on the mend, despite the fact he's 88 years old. He was recovering from double pneumonia. The assumption was that he would slowly, gradually recover from that. The doctors had urged Pope Francis when he left the hospital to rest, not to overexert himself, but clearly this was a pontiff who insisted as much as he physically could to resume his normal activities. Audie?
Yes, and of course did so on Easter Sunday when he offered that blessing, and also met with the Vice President J.D. Vance. So, as you said, despite him being in health for so many of these weeks and even recent years, it still was a surprise to many because of those high-profile appearances yesterday. Ben Wiedemann, thanks so much. We'll be following with you later today. Still ahead on CNN this morning, we're going to return to Rome for more reaction to the breaking news of the death of Pope Francis.
This is the animals of the island. For ceramics, you have limited colors. First, some of them are really traditional colors, 4, 5, maximum 6 colors. And recently, there are some modern pigments. You can use many colors. I have always wanted to be an artist since I'm a little boy. I start from traditional techniques and everything, but you know, as you see, I'm using very contemporary touches on them. I want people, when they look at my works, I want them somehow smile, you know, enjoy it.
Today, we live in an unpredictable environment, and news races around the world at breakneck speed.
How do you feel being in here with these badly wounded soldiers?
I was just being criticized for how I looked.
My show brings you the latest news and top news makers.
What do you want people to know about mortality?
These scenes have been the most emotional scenes for Syrians.
It's corny to say, but it's about love. It's the only thing worth living for.
Amanpour on CNN.
My happy place. One place I could truly be myself.
I feel a deep sense of calm when I'm here.
Whenever my schedule clears, I head straight to my happy place.
Bali allowed me to put myself first.
Thailand seemed very welcoming to me. I hate how good that tasted.
I want people to experience this beautifully intricate, diverse city. There's no other place like it.
My Happy Place premieres April 28th on CNN.
Hong Kong's Visual Arts Museum, M+, is hoping to preserve the city's rich cinematic heritage, restoring old films like The Ark.
The Church by Pope Francis, by choosing cardinals, for example, from the far corners of the world, certainly has changed the way that the leadership of the Church speaks about the Church. It's a look wide. Pope Francis always spoke of going to the margins, to the peripheries, to bring in those who are less engaged, but with an apostolic zeal, an evangelical zeal. That means that Pope Francis wanted people to know Jesus and to become Catholic. He really had an outward focus and a great love for the Church. That was one of his first documents, in fact, was called The Joy of the Gospel, John. And I think a lot of people, when they remember Pope Francis, will remember especially those early days. Again, we've been talking about this news as coming as a great shock. The Pope made many public appearances lately, presenting himself. Of course, he met with the Vice President of the United States, with Vice President J.D. Vance. So the news, again, really has shocked the world, has taken us all by great surprise here to hear.
The Catholic Church's first Latin American pontiff has died at age 88, the Vatican announcing just hours ago.
His final public appearance came on Easter Sunday, just 24 hours ago. He gave an Easter blessing to the thousands of people gathered for Mass at St. Peter's Square. Such a poignant moment for this Pope. 12 years in the papacy, very much a working Pope. He spent weeks in the hospital with severe respiratory ailment, was released just a few weeks ago, but braved his way through Holy Week, through Easter weekend with a reduced schedule, but working nonetheless. His presence very much felt over the last few days, but overnight he did pass away at the age of 88. I want to bring in Christopher Lamb, CNN Vatican correspondent, who is live in Rome. So many firsts when we talk about Pope Francis, Christopher. The first Latin American Pope, the first Jesuit, someone who I think assumed the papacy looking to be a different Pope and then spent 12 years being that different Pope. What's it like to be there this morning with people waking up to this news?
Well, John, the news came as quite a surprise and a shock, given that the Pope had been out on Easter Sunday amongst the people, working until the end. But at the same time, of course, he had been dealing with very serious health difficulties. He'd been in hospital for 38 days. He almost died in hospital on 2 occasions. But it was characteristic of Pope Francis to try and get out of hospital and continue to work. He wanted to serve until the end. Some people speculated he might resign. That was never on his agenda. He wanted to give everything to the role of serving as Pope. As you said, Francis was a Pope of first, the first Pope from Latin America, the first to call himself after St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis, a saint who was dedicated to the poor, to care for creation, to peace. Francis was a pioneer in the church's ministry in these areas. He wrote a very important teaching document on the protection of the environment. He was an outspoken advocate for the poorest in society. He went to be alongside migrants on a number of occasions. His first trip outside of Rome was to Lampedusa, the island where many people were landing from North Africa, risking their lives and sometimes dying in the Mediterranean as they tried to seek a better life. Francis was a pope also for the people. He was a people's pontiff who wanted the church to leave its comfort zones and go out into the midst of suffering humanity. That was Francis's message, and that's what he wanted the church to do. He was someone who shifted the axis of the Catholic Church as well away from its European centre, its Western centre. He appointed cardinals from all over the world, places like Tonga, Haiti, Central African Republic, Mongolia. He dramatically reshaped the College of Cardinals, the body who will elect his successor. And that is a very significant legacy because he has sought to continue to internationalize the Catholic Church. I mean, the growth of the Catholic Church is in many ways outside of Europe and the West. It is growing in Asia and Africa, and Pope Francis sought to reflect that with his appointments. Francis was also an outsider pope. He was elected having never studied or lived in Rome, so he shook up the church establishment here in the Vatican and amongst those in the senior positions in the church. He demanded a church that was more simple, more humble. He called for a poor church for the poor. And that sometimes saw him come up against resistance because he refused to be scripted by the Vatican bureaucracy. He was very much his own man. He did things often without telling other people. He was a pope full of surprises. And even on Easter Sunday, his decision to come out into the square on the Popemobile took a lot of people by surprise, given those health challenges that he'd had. He also appeared on the balcony behind me at St. Peter's to give the final blessing, the Easter Sunday Urbi et Orbi blessing. He was determined to continue to serve, to do that right until the end. And I think here in the square there's a sense of sadness because Francis was a hugely popular pope, a people's pope who continued to serve and to give everything right until the end.
A transformational pope, and I think deliberately so, from the minute that he assumed the papacy until the very end. And it wasn't always linear, was it? I mean, there were times when he had to backtrack slightly from things that he said to explain sentences and proclamations that he had made, but all the while he was pushing for change. You are in St. Peter's Square, Christopher, as you say. Can you just give us a sense of what it is like there this morning in the difference from just 24 hours ago when it was Easter Mass? I think I lost Christopher Lamb, who is in St. Peter's. It has been remarkable over the last several days, Audie, because, of course, the Pope was on a somewhat diminished schedule, recovering from those serious health issues, but he still did manage to get out to a prison, to meet with prisoners, as he had done every year in the papacy prior to Easter. He still did drive through St. Peter's Square in the Pope Mobile yesterday, which was something that Christopher was saying was a surprise. And Christopher Lamb, if you are still with us again, just describe the scene in St. Peter's Square. Oh, we lost him again. The perils of modern television. You can see the pictures right there. Obviously, there are people, there are tourists there. They will be mixed in with people who I think are mourning. They're just to pay their respects to Pope Francis and his 12 years on the throne there, Audie.
Yeah, and
again,
it's a striking moment because
news.
all of these weeks, you had people in the square because he had been so ill, of course, being hospitalized in February, ending up having a respiratory infection which led to damage to both lungs. So people have been worried about the Pope for so many months. And Easter Sunday was supposed to be a respite moment, right, with him coming out and giving that blessing. Now, I want to talk more, John, about his legacy. We're going to turn to Katie McGrady. She's CNN's Vatican analyst and host of the Katie McGrady Show on SiriusXM. That's the Catholic channel. And the channel is operated by the Archdiocese of New York. Katie, thank you so much for being here. First, I want to just start with this moment, with him passing away right in a time when Catholics are celebrating, Christians are celebrating. This is a season of joy. And what strikes you about him passing at this time?
It's very Francis. In some ways, kind of an Irish goodbye from our Holy Father, that we saw him yesterday really push himself, and to wake up this morning to the news, you know, as a faithful Catholic who has met the Holy Father a couple of times and has followed very closely his 12 years and read his documents and his homilies and of course been guided by him. I think Catholics around the world are a little surprised and shocked and shaken up. I mean, I'm looking at the live feed. St. Peter's Square is still very full. And so the thing about us as Catholics is we might be without a pope right now. We are sede vacante. We have no pope on the chair, on the throne, so to speak. But the church still continues, and we'll have a new pope eventually. Right now, of course, we sit in mourning and think about all that he's done over the past dozen years. And I think yesterday was kind of the snapshot quintessential Francis. He pushed himself. I was watching some of the videos last night, so when he was out on the balcony for the Urbi et Orbi, they cut away when they're, you know, kind of getting him ready, and the Holy Father could barely lift his arms to put his glasses on, to put the stole on. It was very much this is a diminished man, and yet he's still here with his people. He's still giving this last final blessing, the Urbi et Orbi, to the city and to the world. And so that's very moving for me as a Catholic to know that he gave us one final Easter Sunday, one final drive around St. Peter's Square, one final kiss of a handful of babies that were passed to him. When they told us he passed at 7:35 this morning, we don't know and might never know the specific details of his final night, but as a Catholic, you know, I'm grateful that we got one last day with the Holy Father yesterday.
You know, his leadership skills, I think, were evident even very young in his career. It was in the early 70s he became head of the Jesuit order in Argentina, and that put him on a path towards Rome. But it's not obvious that he would have been the person to have become Pope. Can you talk about why he was a unique figure in Catholicism?
That's a great question. When the Holy Father was elected in 2013, he wasn't necessarily the dark horse candidate. He had been the number 2 in the prior conclave when Pope Benedict XVI was elected. But I do think a lot of people kind of expected a more career cardinal. And that's a bit of an inside term in the sense of somebody who's in Rome, who's in the Curia. Famously, Pope Francis, the day after he was elected, went to go pay his hotel bill because he really did think he was just going to get to go back to Argentina. Sadly, he never did return to his home country. That was never a place he visited after he assumed the papacy. So when he stepped out on that balcony 12 years ago, there was some gasps and there was some surprise, but we as Catholics believe the Holy Spirit calls forth the leader of the church, and I would say the world needs at the precise moment. And Francis was definitely a pope of the people and would mingle and would mix and would grab hands and would kiss the babies. And obviously all popes are very approachable to the people because they are our Holy Father. But when he was given to us 12 years ago, and now as we say goodbye, so many people are going to have stories of those moments of encounter. And to see that unique pastoral spirit in our church for the past 12 years, to miss that pastoral spirit at this precise moment, there's instances, in fact, where Francis would get out of the Pope mobile when he'd see somebody. There was this famous moment where a man who was covered in sores, the Holy Father steps out and goes and hugs him. Instances where, the Holy Father would pick up the phone and he would call people. And it was kind of the everybody wanted the surprise papal phone call. He was calling the parish in Gaza throughout his hospital stay, as he's done since the war began in October that year. And so I think there's a lot of things we'll be able to notice about what he did over the past 12 years and stories that folks will tell. Inside the church, the Holy Father was a massive shakeup in some ways. The way he governed, the way he appointed people, even the documents that he wrote. And so as we unpack that legacy, especially as we mourn in the next few days of mourning and prepare for his funeral, and then eventually a conclave, what we're going to see is that the Holy Spirit gave the Catholic Church someone very unique in these past dozen years, and will feel the aftershocks of his papacy for many, many more years to come.
And I understand that even comes down to his burial and where he'll be. Can you talk about what details are known about this process?
So we're entering into our 9 days of mourning, and the Holy Father changed some of the particulars. So, for example, how his body will be in rest and state for people to come and pass by. He won't be dressed in the papal finery. He'll be dressed in a simple pastor's cassock. And then he will be buried in St. Mary Majors. Now, this is something that I'm very much looking forward to seeing how it unfolds. Obviously, I miss the Holy Father, and I'm sad we are in this state of mourning, but the Holy Father will be buried in St. Mary Majors. St. Mary Majors is one of the 4 papal basilicas. In fact, Pope Francis visited St. Mary Majors when he got out of the hospital. It was the only place other than a prison that the Holy Father went to outside of the Vatican after his hospital stay. We've known he wants to be buried there for a long time. They've made the arrangements for it. It is where the Salus Populi Romani, his favorite Marian image, is kept. And that image of Our Lady, Pope Francis would go and visit before every trip, and he would visit it upon his return. And so he'll be buried there. We don't know which chapel, or I don't know which chapel specifically in St. Mary Majors. He'll be the first Holy Father, the first Pope to be buried outside of St. Peter's Basilica since 1903, when Pope Leo XIII was buried in St. John Lateran, another of the 4 papal basilicas. Since we're in a Jubilee year, these basilicas have been very crowded, so I think it's unique that he'll be buried there outside of St. Peter's Basilica, and will, I think, increase the foot traffic. People are certainly going to want to go and pray at his grave when he's placed there.
Katie, you're host of a show on SiriusXM's Catholic channel that's operated by the Archdiocese of New York. We're seeing images, obviously, of Rome, but do you also expect to have people gather in the Archdiocese of New York, other places in the U.S.?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. In fact, when the Holy Father went into the hospital in February, obviously we were not anticipating a funeral anytime soon, but internally, dioceses around the country begin to make plans. So in this papal mourning period, we're in a 9-day period of mourning, masses will be said by the cardinals of the world in the places where they serve and the dioceses they run. And then throughout the church, even in the tiniest chapel, there will be masses said for the Holy Father. There will be black bunting that is hung. We, of course, are without a pope. So we, in the Eucharistic prayer, when the priest will say, we pray for our pope, we don't have a pope right now. So they pray for the repose of the soul of the prior pope. So yes, there will be mourning around the world. His photo will be taken off the wall because he is gone and he is not the pope anymore. And so as all these arrangements are made, there's also the thinking about when the funeral is going to be and when the conclave is going to be, of course. But at this precise moment, certainly. In fact, the Vatican announced just a little while ago there will be a rosary tonight. There will be an official certification of the death. I believe it's at 8 o'clock Rome time this evening. So we're entering into this phase of, yes, we are in Easter joy, in the Easter octave, where we believe every day is like an Easter Sunday until next Sunday. But we're also in a period of, we remember our Holy Father, we pray for the repose of his soul, and we ask the Lord to be with us in this phase of our church's life.
It's Katie McGrady, CNN's Vatican analyst. So sorry for your loss in this moment, and the loss of for so many Catholics and people around the world. And John, this is also a moment where we're seeing people gather in St. Peter's Square. People have been there for weeks and months because the Holy Father had been ill. And yesterday it was thought that him coming out was a different moment, right? A reprieve, and perhaps that he was on the mend.
It was certainly a moment now that will be remembered quite differently, as he, I think, bravely faced his own mortality the last few weeks, coming out of the hospital like that, but then still participating in Easter weekend. And that was such a fascinating discussion you just had with Katie McGrady, because we're now entering, obviously, this period which has over 1,000 years of tradition, the passing of a pope, the naming of a new pope, but still with so much tradition, Pope Francis, who regularly pushed against, I think, some of the ceremony of the Catholic Church. His passing will be part of that tradition, but on his own terms, being buried in a basilica where no pope has been laid to rest in more than 100 years. I think a testament to the change that he sought in the Catholic Church. All right, coming up after the break, we're going to continue our breaking news coverage as Catholics around the world mourn the passing of Pope Francis.
If we want security, let us give security. If we want life, let us give life. If we want opportunities, let us provide these opportunities. The yardstick we use for others will be the yardstick which time use for us.
Pontiff has died at age 88, the Vatican announcing just hours ago.
His final public appearance came on Easter Sunday, just 24 hours ago. He gave an Easter blessing to the thousands of people gathered for Mass at St. Peter's Square. Such a poignant moment for this Pope. 12 years in the papacy, very much a working Pope. He spent weeks in the hospital with severe respiratory ailment, was released just a few weeks ago, but braved his way through Holy Week, through Easter weekend with a reduced schedule, but working nonetheless. His presence very much felt over the last few days, but overnight he did pass away at the age of 88. I want to bring in Christopher Lamb, CNN Vatican correspondent, who is live in Rome. So many firsts when we talk about Pope Francis, Christopher. The first Latin American Pope, the first Jesuit, someone who I think assumed the papacy looking to be a different pope, and then spent 12 years being that different pope. What's it like to be there this morning with people waking up to this news?
Well, John, the news came as quite a surprise and a shock, given that the Pope had been out on Easter Sunday amongst the people, working until the end. But at the same time, of course, he had been dealing with very serious health difficulties. He'd been in hospital for 38 days. He almost died in hospital on 2 occasions. But it was characteristic of Pope Francis to try and get out of hospital and continue to work. He wanted to serve until the end. Some people speculated he might resign. That was never on his agenda. He wanted to give everything to the role of serving as Pope. As you said, Francis was a Pope of first, the first Pope from Latin America, the first to call himself after St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis, a saint who was dedicated to the poor, to care for creation, to peace. Francis was a pioneer in the church's ministry in these areas. He wrote a very important teaching document on the protection of the environment. He was an outspoken advocate for the poorest in society. He went to be alongside migrants on a number of occasions. His first trip outside of Rome was to Lampedusa, the island where many people were landing from North Africa, risking their lives and sometimes dying in the Mediterranean as they tried to seek a better life. Francis was a pope also for the people. He was a people's pontiff who wanted the church to leave its comfort zones and go out into the midst of suffering humanity. That was Francis's message, and that's what he wanted the church to do. He was someone who shifted the axis of the Catholic Church as well away from its European centre, its Western centre. He appointed cardinals from all over the world, places like Tonga, Haiti, Central African Republic, Mongolia. He dramatically reshaped the College of Cardinals, the body who will elect his successor. And that is a very significant legacy because he has sought to continue to internationalize the Catholic Church. I mean, the growth of the Catholic Church is in many ways outside of Europe and the West. It is growing in Asia and Africa, and Pope Francis sought to reflect that with his appointments. Francis was also an outsider pope. He was elected having never studied or lived in Rome, so he shook up the church establishment here in the Vatican and amongst those in the senior positions in the church. He demanded a church that was more simple, more humble. He called for a poor church for the poor. And that sometimes saw him come up against resistance because he refused to be scripted by the Vatican bureaucracy. He was very much his own man. He did things often without telling other people. He was a pope full of surprises. And even on Easter Sunday, his decision to come out into the square on the Pope-mobile took a lot of people by surprise, given those health challenges that he'd had. He also
lead the throne. We're going to go now to Rome, where CNN senior international correspondent Ben Wiedemann has been there this morning, seeing people gather and in the reaction. First, can you talk a little bit about sort of what you've been hearing in terms of reaction from leaders around the world?
Well, certainly we're seeing an outpouring, Adia, of condolences from leaders around the world, from the White House, from Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, from the Israeli President, even from Hamas, which has expressed its condolences for Pope Francis. This was a man who was not seen as particularly negative or sort of anybody's enemy. He was a man who believed in dialogue and speaking to everyone, in trying to build bridges. He was a voice of compassion, of understanding, of humility in an age when those qualities seem to be increasingly rare among world leaders. So certainly his passing is being felt not just by Catholics, but others around the world. Here in Rome, of course, we've been hearing the church bells have been going off. More and more people seem to be gathering at St. Peter's Square, which is oftentimes the case. Keeping in mind that today is a national holiday. It's Pasquetta, the day after Easter, when normally people will go out and enjoy the spring weather, go to the beach, go to the mountains, have picnics, family gatherings. But all of that perhaps is going to change. For instance, the Serie A, the main football or soccer league in Italy, has postponed 4 games that were supposed to be held today. So really, the country and probably beyond Italy, many areas, normal functions are coming to a pausing, at least, to mark the passing of a man who was certainly larger than life. Audie?
No, that's Ben Wiedemann. He's going to be with us throughout the day, reporting more. I'm going to turn now to Elise Allen, because she's the senior correspondent at Crux Now, which is a publication that covers the Vatican. Elise, thank you so much for joining us on this moment. Crux story is saying that he was an electrifying, maverick pope, leaving behind a roller coaster legacy. Could you talk about that description?
Sure thing, Audie. You know, Pope Francis was somebody that whether, you know, you agreed with him or not, he made a difference. He got your attention. He shook things up. That was something he did from the very beginning. You know, I think even the choice not to live in the Vatican's Apostolic Palace, to live instead in its Santa Marta guest house, you know, instead of going straight into, you know, his residence after his election, taking the bus back with all the other cardinals. He's somebody that started making a change and started shaking things up from the very beginning. You know, and we saw that throughout his papacy, you know, whether it was disregard for protocol or some of the familiar, you know, language that he used, very accessible. You know, and changing the church's language on, for example, you know, its approach to the issue of homosexuality.
Yeah.
And his desire for more women in the church. These are all things where he really, you know, was that electrifying presence, or he was a bit of a maverick. And people, you know, sometimes they agreed, sometimes they didn't, but you can't argue that he wasn't stirring something up.
Thank you so much, Elise, for speaking with us. Elise is senior correspondent at Crux Now. As we've been talking about this morning, just a few hours, 7:35 local time, the Cardinals announced the death of Pope Francis. He obviously had been in ill health for many months, beginning in February, where he had a bronchial infection. His last couple of hours spent doing the Easter blessing on Sunday, also meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance, where they had a conversation about theology and also reportedly some of the politics of the day. It is a day of mourning in Rome and around the world. We want you to stay with us, because CNN's breaking news coverage of the death of the Pope is going to continue right now.
This is CNN Breaking News.
You know, his leadership skills, I think, were evident even very young in his career. It was in the early 70s he became head of the Jesuit order in Argentina, and that put him on a path towards Rome. But it's not obvious that he would have been the person to have become Pope. Can you talk about why he was a unique figure in Catholicism?
That's a great question. When the Holy Father was elected in 2013, he wasn't necessarily the dark horse candidate. He had been the number 2 in the prior conclave when Pope Benedict XVI was elected. But I do think a lot of people kind of expected a more career cardinal. And that's a bit of an inside term in the sense of somebody who's in Rome, who's in the Curia. Famously, Pope Francis, the day after he was elected, went to go pay his hotel bill, because he really did think he was just going to get to go back to Argentina. Sadly, he never did return to his home country. That was never a place he visited after he assumed the papacy. So when he stepped out on that balcony 12 years ago, there was some gasps and there was some surprise, but we as Catholics believe the Holy Spirit calls forth the leader of the church, and I would say the world needs at the precise moment. And Francis was definitely a pope of the people, and would mingle and would mix and would grab hands and would kiss the babies. And obviously all popes are very approachable to the people because they are our Holy Father. But when he was given to us 12 years ago, and now as we say goodbye, so many people are going to have stories of those moments of encounter.
St. Peter's marking the death of Pope Francis. Of course, Francis was a hugely popular pope. On Easter Sunday, yesterday, he was touring St. Peter's Square amongst the crowds, amongst the people who were delighted to see him, even though he was clearly still struggling health-wise. Of course, he was trying to recover from double pneumonia, and he was still at that point really not well. But Francis was very much a people's pope, and so he was someone who connected with the ordinary believer, and not just Catholics. He was also very popular amongst other Christians and other believers. So there is a real sense of sadness here after the news came through this morning at 7:35 a.m. from Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Carmelengo of the Roman Curia, the Church's central administration. He announced the news this morning. So really, as I said, a sense of sadness, a somber atmosphere. Francis, of course, was an outsider pope too. He had never lived and studied in Rome when he was elected, and he shook up the Vatican and church establishment, sometimes facing fierce opposition in his attempts to reform the Catholic Church, his attempts to have a church that was closer to the poor, that was more welcoming. Francis, of course, was the Pope who shifted the approach of the Catholic Church when it came to same-sex couples. He offered blessings to them. He also was the Pope who said, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about gay priests. So Francis shifted the Catholic Church's pastoral approach on that question, and also when it came to things such as dialogue with other faiths, he reached out to Muslim leaders. He had a very strong rapport with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, the seat of Sunni learning in Egypt. So there is a great sense of sadness here as the news of such a reforming pope, a pope for the people, who has died this morning.
He'd been so sick, fought through the illness, I think bravely made it through Easter week and holiday week, and surprised so many people, I think, by appearing in the Pope Mobile in St. Peter's Square yesterday and then passing just after Easter this morning. People in St. Peter's Square yesterday observing Easter Mass, and they are there this morning behind Christopher. He also appointed more than half the cardinals who will choose his successor. And of course, we're now entering this period where there will be even more change and flux inside the Catholic Church. Let's bring in Nick Robertson now to talk about that. Nick, so what next?
Well, certainly what we're hearing from world leaders is that sense of loss that the Catholic faithful are feeling today, and perhaps summed up best by Micheál Martin, the Irish Prime Minister. He was there when the Pope obviously visited in 2018 at a time when the Catholic Church in Ireland was having difficulty settling its demons of the past, the clerical sexual abuse scandal. That was something that Pope Francis wanted to set right, if you will. What we've heard from Micheál Martin, the Irish Prime Minister, today is that the world has lost a leader. That really sets the tone. He was a leader for compassion, for humanity. We've heard similar expressions coming from so many European and other leaders today. The British Prime Minister saying that hope was at the heart of his leadership, that he was a pope for the poor. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, saying that he brought hope to the poorest, hope and joy to the poorest. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, touching on a point that I think is what's felt beyond the Catholic community. She said he touched millions of people beyond the Catholic faith, because of his humanity, because he wanted to help the poor. We've heard from the President of Israel today, Isaac Herzog, talking about the importance of the interfaith dialogue that Pope Francis was keen to push forward. Shehbaz Sharif, the Prime Minister in Pakistan, echoing that as well. From New Zealand, we've heard the Prime Minister there, again, praising the humanity of the Pope. This was a Pope who wanted to help the poor, who felt keenly the suffering of the poor, who felt that his voice could add and lend a hand and help not just be a pastor, if you will, to their spiritual needs, but actually bring change by highlighting their plight, by putting that on the world stage, by communicating with these leaders who are remembering him today.
In so many ways, Nick, he was transformational, as you say. The way he ascended to the papacy, transformational to begin with. Pope Benedict retired, basically, and then Pope Francis, again, ascended to the papal throne in a very different way, trying to be a very different pope. And as you mentioned, he has stood up for migrants at a time when I think the global trends have gone against immigration. His first trip as Pope was to the Italian island of Lampedusa, which at that point was a center for migration from Africa and Asia toward Europe. This was something that he worked for and fought for, even against many world trends.
And against the trend, in some ways, of popular opinion in Italy, which really grew to resent the presence of migrants. And that trip, our correspondent Christopher Lamb was talking about this just earlier. When the Pope first decided to make that trip, his first as Pope, to Lampedusa, he originally tried to book it through the Italian airline in his own name, not his given name as Pope. He didn't try to book it as Pope Francis. The airline contacted the Vatican to find out what was going on. This was extraordinary. So his first mission, if you will, was to try to help and bring enlightenment to the rest of us about compassion and help here. And again, his trip 2018 to Ireland, I use that as just one of many that were out there. This was, again, at a time where the Catholic Church was having huge difficulty with its image, with its legacy, with the abuse scandal that was dogging it. And in Ireland, this was a country that was so conservative in its values. And this was a pope who pushed that. The country was moving forward. But he was an enabler and a pusher of that modernization in that way, if you will.
No question about that. I love the idea of him trying to book an e-ticket to Lampedusa. This would not have been long after he tried to pay his own hotel bill for staying in Rome during the conclave that elected him Pope.
And what address he gives is his billing address. I mean, it's all... Yeah. Thank you guys both very much. We're going to continue with so much more of this breaking news of the passing of Pope Francis. Coming up for us, more of what we're hearing from world leaders as reaction is really beginning to come in as we speak this morning. And also breaking overnight, we're also covering this, a second signal chat. Sources revealing that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth shared detailed military plans to another signal chat, this one including his wife and his brother.
Early in his life, Obin Gieko was determined to live his passion even through adversity.
This is my childhood neighborhood. It's where I grew up. It's a neighborhood where residents face difficult social situations. For several years, it has had a bad reputation in organized crime, juvenile delinquency in general. These social issues have stigmatized the neighborhood.
Obin beat the stigma. He went on to study computer science at Cote d'Ivoire's largest city, Abidjan, then got a job as an IT engineer.
While I was in the company, I continued to take online courses. It was through this course that I was able to discover the concept of Fab Lab, a manufacturing laboratory that started in the United States. I had the idea of creating the first Fab Lab in Cote d'Ivoire in order to create social innovation through digital technology.
The games really allowed people to see another side of skateboarding and cleared up some misconceptions they had. In Hong Kong and across the world, a lot more people are taking up the sport. My name is Luk Chun Yin. People call me Junjai. I'm a professional skateboarder. I started in elementary school when a friend lent me a skateboard, and it's been 22 years since then. I think the atmosphere for skateboarding has improved in Hong Kong. I'm happy that I can skateboard in such a beautiful environment and perform for the public. For me, promoting skateboarding to people in Hong Kong is much more important than winning prizes.
And then Erwin Winkler said, well, maybe, what about the two parts? I said, let me think about that. And then changing and morphing into something even better.
You're either in or you're out.
You're looking at live pictures right now of Mass being celebrated inside St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York City. This is happening as we speak on the very morning the world is learning of the passing of Pope Francis, who passed away early this morning at the age of 88. And we continue to follow this breaking news this morning. Pope Francis, known and loved for his humility, his care for the poor and the world's least fortunate and most downtrodden. Before giving the traditional Easter blessing from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica yesterday, Pope Francis met privately. You see pictures there. He had met privately with Vice President J.D. Vance. And Vance put out a statement this morning, writing in part, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill. I will always remember him for the homily he gave in the very early days of COVID. May God rest his soul." Just some of the reaction that we're getting in, and we will be bringing to you throughout the morning. CNN's Ben Wiedemann is standing by in Rome. Let's go to Ben now. And Ben, you have lived in Rome, covered the Pope for years. What can we expect to see in the coming hours and days?
Well, I think what we're seeing now are just the first acts in the Vatican that happen after the passing of a pope. We understand that his papal ring will be removed, if it hasn't already. His study and his apartment in the Casa Santa Marta, the Spartan Hotel at the Vatican, will be sealed, and his body will be moved to the chapel in the Casa Santa Marta, where the head of the Vatican Medical Services will examine the body, ascertain the cause of death, write up a report, and his body will remain in that chapel until the funeral takes place. Now, we understand there will be rosary prayers at the Vatican this evening to mark the passing, the initial ritual, so to speak, of the passing of the Pope. And then, of course, there are the very complex and difficult preparations for his funeral. The Vatican has yet to announce exactly when that is going to happen, but we can assume at this point that they are already sending out the invitations to 252 cardinals around the world to come to Rome, to come to the Vatican, to attend the funeral. And then, of course, there's the conclave, where those cardinals will ponder first, of course, and figure out who they want to be the next pope. But that's very much several days, if not weeks, ahead of us. The focus now, of course, is the funeral and the memory of a pope who many Italians and Catholics around the world considered a a man who really symbolized humility, charity, understanding for those least fortunate. Here in Italy, the flags have been lowered to half-mast. In Spain, for instance, they've declared 3 days of mourning. Certainly for many, normal life is going to come to an end as they mark the passing of this very popular Pope.
Yep, Ben Wiedemann, thank you so much. Much more to come from Ben. You offer such great insight in all of his time there. Thank you, Ben.
Obviously, we're going to be following the news out of Vatican City, out of Rome, all morning long. There is also other breaking news this morning. A top former aide to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says he does not think...
A hugely popular Pope on Easter Sunday. Yesterday he was touring St. Peter's Square amongst the crowds, amongst the people who were delighted to see him, even though he was clearly still struggling health-wise. Of course, he was trying to recover from double pneumonia, and he was still at that point really not well. But Francis was very much a people's pope, marking the death of Pope Francis. Of course, Francis was a hugely popular pope. On Easter Sunday, yesterday, he was touring St. Peter's Square amongst the crowds, amongst the people who were delighted to see him, even though he was clearly still struggling health-wise. Of course, he was trying to recover from double pneumonia, and he was still at that point really not well. But Francis was very much a people's pope, and so he was someone who connected with the ordinary believer, and not just Catholics. He was also very popular amongst other Christians and other believers. So there is a real sense of sadness here after the news came through this morning at 7:35 a.m. from Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Carmelengo of the Roman Curia, the Church's central administration. He announced the news this morning. So really, as I said, a sense of sadness, a somber atmosphere. Francis, of course, was an outsider pope too. He had never lived and studied in Rome when he was elected, and he shook up the Vatican and church establishment, sometimes facing fierce opposition in his attempts to reform the Catholic Church, his attempts to have a church that was closer to the poor, that was more welcoming. Francis, of course, was the Pope who shifted the approach of the Catholic Church when it came to same-sex couples. He offered blessings to them. He also was the Pope who said, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about gay priests. So Francis shifted the Catholic Church's pastoral approach on that